Picture the smell of hot bitumen on a summer afternoon in 1973, a transistor radio crackling out skyhooks, someone's dad pulling into the driveway in a car he's quietly furious about because it's already leaking, or rattling, or it pulled hard left the entire way home from work. That's the Australia these cars lived in, and the one at the very top of this list did something so unexpected it became a ghost story. We'll get there. It's number 1. And it might just surprise you. This is a countdown of the 10 worst Australian cars of the 1970s, from 10 all the way down to 1. Let's get into it. Number 10. Holden Sunbird, 1976 to 1980. The Holden Sunbird doesn't get mentioned much these days, which is really the only kindness history has shown it. In 1976, Holden quietly rebadged the aging 4-cylinder Torana and called it the Sunbird. The thinking was sound enough. They needed a budget entry-level car to compete with the flood of cheap Japanese imports coming in. And the Torana platform was already paid for. Why not use it? The problem was the engine. The little 1.9-litre Starfire 4-cylinder was a noisy, thirsty, temperamental unit that never seemed entirely comfortable in its own skin. Owners reported constant stalling, carburetors that needed adjustment every few months, door bottoms that rusted out so quickly that some owners were keeping spare doors lined up in the garage. That's not an exaggeration. That's from people who owned them. The Sunbird was the kind of car that asked something of you every week. Not a lot, just a little bit, just enough to slowly grind you down. There was something deeply dispiriting about a brand as proud as Holden selling Australians a tired old platform with a difficult engine at a time when Datsuns and Toyotas were offering genuine reliability for similar money. But hey, at least it looked like a car. The next one had a harder time even managing that. Number 9. Ford Cortina 6, 1972 to 1980. Here's a detail most people miss about the Ford Cortina 6. The Cortina itself was actually a pretty decent car in 4-cylinder form. Light, nimble, good to drive on Australian roads. Then Ford Australia saw the success Holden was having with the 6-cylinder Torana and decided they needed to do the same thing. So they took the compact Cortina body and shoehorned in the big Falcon 6, a 3.3-litre or even a 4.1-litre straight 6, borrowed from a car that was significantly larger. And because there wasn't room for it without modification, they stretched the nose forward to make it fit. The result was a car with almost comically wrong proportions, and handling that one period reviewer memorably described as wanting to go straight when you wanted it to turn, and wanting to lean when you wanted it to stay flat. The front end was simply too heavy for the chassis underneath it. Under hard braking, it would dive nose first like a startled pelican. On uneven surfaces, and Australian country roads were full of those, it would wander. The suspension components wore out at a rate that kept mechanics busy. The power bulge in the center of the bonnet, which was there to clear the taller engine, became one of the most recognizable styling cues of the era. Recognizable, but not exactly admired. Ford tried to fix it over successive revisions, but the fundamental problem never went away. When a car's flaw is baked into the engineering, no number of updates can fully cure it. Still, the Cortina 6 only hurt your front tires and your confidence. The next one hurt your dignity too. Number 8. Triumph Stag, 1972 to 1977. The Triumph Stag is one of those cars that sounds wonderful until you've actually read about owning one. It came to Australia in 1972, and on paper, it was everything a sports car buyer could want. A genuine V8 convertible, made in Britain, with a sweeping roofline and 2+2 seating. Here was a car meant to take on the Mercedes SL, a genuine rival. Something aspirational. The engine was the problem. Triumph's 3.0-litre V8 used aluminium heads mated to an iron block, a combination that, when the cooling system wasn't maintained perfectly, would cause the heads to warp, the gaskets to blow, and eventually the timing chain to snap. The coolant temperature sender was placed in only one of the 2-cylinder heads, which meant one side of the engine could be overheating catastrophically, while the gauge on the dash read completely normal. You wouldn't know until the damage was done. There are genuine stories of Stags overheating on test drives in Sydney dealerships, of mechanics recommending that buyers simply rip out the Triumph engine and drop in a Rover or Holden V8 instead. What stings is that the rest of the car was genuinely lovely. The styling still holds up, and with a reliable engine underneath it, it would have been a proper sports car. But this was the British Leyland of the early 1970s, and proper quality control wasn't really their thing at the time. The Stag that could have been is the tragedy here. The Stag that actually was is entry number 8, and we're still going deeper. The next one was built right here at home, which made it somehow worse. Number 7. Leyland Marina, 1972 to 1974. We're staying with Leyland for this one, but now we're talking about a car that was assembled in Australia, in a factory in Zetland in Sydney, from kits sent over from Cowley in England. The Leyland Marina arrived here in April 1972, as British Leyland's answer to the Ford Cortina. The idea wasn't bad. The Cortina was selling well, the market wanted a medium family car, and Leyland thought they had one. They were wrong. The Marina used a platform rooted in the old Morris Minor, a car from 1948. The suspension was ancient lever arm design. The handling, in the words of one very famous later critic, was like a skip on wheels. In Australian conditions, the heat, the corrugated country roads, the long highway stretches, its limitations were exposed almost immediately. And then, in late 1973, Leyland made it worse. They tried to do what Holden had done with the Tirana and stuffed a 6-cylinder engine in. This time, the same big red 6 motor from the P76. The front subframe had to be modified to take the weight. The result was a car that not only handled poorly, but now understeered so aggressively that one journalist of the time wrote something so blunt it was barely printable. The Marina was gone from Australian showrooms by 1974, and when the Zetland factory closed, that was the end of it. One of the shortest production runs in local automotive history, and one of the most deserved exits. We're at the halfway point now, and from here the stories get stranger and more expensive. The next car was built to challenge the whole market, and it challenged mainly your patience. Number 6. Chrysler Centura, 1975 to 1977. The Chrysler Centura has one of the most chaotic backstories of any car ever sold in Australia, and the car itself was almost an afterthought by the time it arrived. It started life as a French Simca, the Chrysler 180, a perfectly competent European family car. Chrysler Australia wanted to use it as their mid-market entry, slotting between the small Galant and the big Valiant. Australian engineers went to France, got involved in the development process, and the Centura KB was created, with a stretched nose grafted on to accommodate either a 3.5-litre or 4.0-litre Hemi 6, borrowed from the Valiant. Then France started nuclear testing in the Pacific. The Australian dockworkers' unions refused to handle anything French. The Centura's bodies sat on wharves for 2 years. By the time the car actually reached showrooms in mid-1975, it was 2 years late, and the market had moved on. When it did arrive, the handling was described as a lead-tipped arrow. All that Hemi weight hanging over the front axle made the nose dive under braking, gave it a nervous wandering quality on straight roads, and made it profoundly unwelcoming in corners. The NRMA, the New South Wales Motoring Authority, secretly purchased one from a Sydney dealer to evaluate it, and found a list of faults that included a cigarette lighter that didn't fit its socket, windscreen wipers that didn't work, and front indicators that came on when you hit the brakes. There's something almost poetic about a car being saved from French nuclear politics, only to arrive in a condition like that. It was gone by 1978, and the further we go down this list, the more familiar some of these themes are going to feel. Number 5. Holden HJ Kingswood, 1974 to 1976. Now this might be the most controversial entry on this list, so let me be precise about what I'm saying and what I'm not. The Kingswood was Australia's family car. The HJ series, released in October 1974, was the car in practically every second driveway in the country, from Elizabeth in South Australia to Acacia Ridge in Brisbane. It was comfortable, spacious, and for a lot of Australians, it was simply the default choice. But default isn't the same as good. The HJ was a car that had barely moved on from the HQ before it, which had barely moved on from the HZ before that. The live rear axle was an antique by international standards. The fuel economy, even on the 6s, was brutal in a decade, being defined by 2 oil crises. After the 1973 oil shock, and then again in 1979, Australians were suddenly paying close attention to what their car was drinking, and the Kingswood's 6-cylinder engine wasn't answering with anything reassuring. The interiors were durable but grim, the kind of vinyl that sat in the sun all day and left a heat brand on the back of your legs in January. Rust developed in the lower quarters with unseemly enthusiasm. What really earns the HJ its place here is what was happening around it. The Japanese had arrived in force by 1974, more reliable, better built, more economical. And Holden's answer was to keep building essentially the same car and hope the Australian public stayed loyal. For a while they did, but the cracks, literal and figurative, were showing. The next car on this list tried harder. It failed faster. Number 4. Chrysler Galant, 1970 to 1977. Few people remember that Chrysler Australia was selling Mitsubishis in the 1970s under their own name, but they were, and the Galant is the most interesting example of how that arrangement both worked and didn't. The Chrysler Valiant Galant arrived in 1970, built on the Mitsubishi Galant platform and fitted with Chrysler Australia's own Hemi 4-cylinder engine, 1.5 litres initially, later 1.8 litres. The thinking was smart. There was a gap between the tiny economy imports and the full-size Holdens and Falcons, and the Galant was meant to fill it. On the road, the Galant was competent enough, but the Hemi 4 was a heavy agricultural unit in a car that really wanted something lighter and more modern. Fuel economy was poor, the performance was underwhelming, and the cars built in the first couple of years suffered from build quality that was inconsistent at best. Panel gaps, rattling trim, electrics that had a tendency to misbehave. What really sealed the Galant's fate was what happened in 1977, when Mitsubishi started selling their cars here as Mitsubishis instead of through Chrysler. The Chrysler Sigma that replaced the Galant was a genuine revelation. Well-built, well-resolved, a car that immediately started pulling sales away from Holden, which rather suggested the Galant had been holding Mitsubishi's engineering talent back all along. The Galant wasn't a disaster, it was something almost sadder, a car that was adequate when adequate wasn't enough. And now, we're getting to the ones that stick in the memory for all the wrong reasons. Number 3. Ford Cortina TC Rust Special, 1972. I know what you're thinking. I already covered the Cortina 6, but the standard 4-cylinder TC Cortina deserves its own entry for a completely different reason. Where the Cortina 6 had an engineering problem, the TC Cortina had a manufacturing problem. The MK3 body was a complex shape, full of curves and creases that looked wonderful in the brochure, but turned out to be remarkably good at trapping water and mud and holding onto them indefinitely. The panel fit on Australian market cars was often poor straight from the factory, and the steel used was simply not up to Australian conditions. The humidity, the temperature swings, the road spray. People were finding rust in TC Cortinas within 2 years of purchase. Not surface rust, structural rust. Sills, floors, the areas around the rear wheel arches that would crumble if you pushed too hard with a thumb. Ford eventually addressed it with successive updates, and the later TD series improved things somewhat. But the TC Cortina's reputation for going rusty while you were still paying it off was something that trailed the model for years. And in a country where people expected their cars to last a decade or more, where a family might keep a car through 2 or 3 kids' school years, rusting out early was a betrayal of something fundamental. Most people don't realize just how many TC Cortinas simply rotted away. Walk into any wrecker's yard in 1979, and there they were, queued up like they'd given up. The next entry never even had a chance to rust. It had bigger problems from day one. Number 2. Leyland P76, 1973 to 1974. We're in the last seconds before the reveal of number 1, and I want to plant the thought again, because you need to understand just how bad that number 1 is. When I tell you that the Leyland P76 is only number 2 on this list, and it's arguably Australia's most famous automotive disaster of the entire century. The P76 arrived in 1973 to enormous fanfare. It was genuinely ambitious, an all-new large Australian car from British Leyland, designed to take on the Kingswood and the Falcon head-on. It had a brand-new all-aluminium V8 engine. It had rack and pinion steering when Australian competitors were still using older setups. Wheels magazine gave it Car of the Year in 1973. And then it started falling apart, not metaphorically, literally. There were documented cases of wheels simply leaving the car at speed. The door sealing was so poor that Leyland's own service manager for Victoria and Tasmania, a man named Ian Thomas, recalls arriving at his office in Airport West each morning to find 6 or more owners waiting for him, their cars filled sill to sill with water after overnight rain. His solution, initially, was to drill holes in the floor to let the water drain out. The spark plugs ran too cool and needed replacing at the first service on most cars. The panel gaps were famous. Quality control at the Zetland factory was, by multiple accounts, essentially absent by 1974. And all the while, the oil crisis was making large car buyers think twice. Leyland Australia lost around $71 million on the P76 and its accompanying Marina. The Zetland factory closed. British Leyland left Australia. Approximately 18,000 P76s had been built. It was a catastrophe of management, engineering, timing, and bad luck, all arriving at once. And yet, the P76 is only number 2, because the car at number 1 did something even more astounding. Number 1. Leyland P76 Force 7 Coupe, 1974. Here's the thing about the P76 story that almost nobody talks about. While the standard P76 was struggling in showrooms and hemorrhaging money, Leyland Australia committed to building a coupe version. They called it the Force 7. It was a genuinely beautiful car, a proper sporting coupe on the P76 platform, styled by Giovanni Michelotti, the Italian designer responsible for some of the most elegant cars of the era. It had a committed following before it had even been built. Pre-production cars were photographed and published. Enthusiasts were excited. Orders were forming. Leyland built approximately a dozen pre-production Force 7 coupes at their Zetland factory in 1974, and then the whole operation collapsed before a single customer car could be delivered. The Force 7 never reached production. The factory closed, the company folded, and those handful of pre-production cars, some of the most anticipated Australian cars of the decade, simply vanished into storage, into private collections, into history. Think about what that means. This is a car that was wanted, that was designed, that was built in prototype form, that had people genuinely excited in a decade when Australian car culture was at its absolute peak, and it was taken away not because anyone chose to cancel it, but because the company that made it simply ceased to exist before it could arrive. The P76 was a disaster, but the Force 7 is the ghost, the car that never was, for all the most heartbreaking reasons. No other car on this list came so close to being wonderful before disappearing entirely. That, to me, is the ultimate automotive tragedy. Not just a bad car, a great car that never got the chance. And that's our 10. What's worth saying now is that every single car on this list, even the ones that failed spectacularly, came from people who were genuinely trying to build something that Australians would love. The engineers at Zetland working on the P76, the Chrysler team who went to France to make the Centura Australian, the Ford Australia people who thought the Cortina 6 could be their Tirana. They weren't wrong to try. The 1970s was the last great decade of genuine Australian automotive ambition before the industry began its long, slow retreat. These cars, for all their flaws, are part of that story. The rust, the leaks, the wandering front ends, the overheating V8s, they're all chapters in the history of a country that built its own cars for nearly a century and then lost that ability entirely. The cars that failed tell you as much about Australia in the 70s as the ones that succeeded, maybe more. Now I want to hear from you. Which of these cars did someone in your family actually own? Maybe it was the one that tested your dad's patience every winter morning, or the one your mum finally convinced him to sell after the 3rd time it went into the shop. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. If you're new here, Sunburnt Chrome is the channel for Australian automotive history told properly. Subscribe if that sounds like your kind of thing. And if you found something in this video worth sharing, a detail you didn't know, a car you remember, the like button really does help more people find the channel. Thanks for watching. See you next time.